So I guess I would start, where I would start in thinking about psychoanalytic feminism is probably Nancy Chodorow, who came out with the reproduction of mothering in 1978. And I think one of the things that was interesting about her work is that she was moving to a drawing on an object relations paradigm and particularly also the paradigm of separation, individuation of Mahler, and trying to, she was a sociologist, and she had been studying psychoanalytic object relations. Now she's a psychoanalyst, but then she was a sociologist. And she was looking, although it wasn't explicit, she really was looking at the 50s family and a paradigm where mothers had been, middle-class mothers, white mothers, had been sort of pushed back into the home after World War II, and then moved out into the suburbs, and the husbands were gone for most of the day, and the mothers were responsible for childcare. And she started to make the argument that in the separation process, the separation individuation process was different for boys and girls, and that it led to a different versions of self. And I find that actually really quite significant, maybe in antithesis to what we're talking about here, the self. I always try to differentiate between versions of autonomy, versions of dependence, versions of selfhood. Like talk about neoliberal subjectivity, you're rooting it in a specific space and time. So I think that she was starting to make that kind of differentiation, that how you grew up, what your gender was, determined what kind of attachment patterns you had and what kind of what your self-esteem was based on. So in her version of psychoanalytic feminism, the girl's self-esteem was rooted in relationality and attachment, because she identified with the mother and she never had to separate. She never, was required to break from that relationship with the mother. Whereas the boy, drawing again on separation individuation theory, people like Greenson and Stoller were arguing that the boy starts out with a symbiotic relationship to the mother, so sort of a proto-femininity, and then has to break that, has to separate, individuate, and identify with the father. And then that the fathers were absent made the boys, I can't believe I'm doing this, made the boys, they were identifying more with abstractions like cultural figures. That's where the version of masculinity came from. So I felt like her book, in a way, was an argument about why men and women who grew up at this era and then got married in the 60s and 70s were ending up getting divorced. Because their senses of self, their basis of their self-esteem was quite opposite. And so the women were looking for increased intimacy, and the men's selfhood was based on the distancing from too much intimacy, and what that version of autonomy. So that version of autonomy that she described, I think, was the version that then all of feminists from whatever school they came from, whether it was Judith Butler or Jessica Benjamin, they were all critiquing, feminist psychoanalysts were all critiquing that version of autonomy that was based in a repudiation of relationship. So now I guess the next figure I would turn to would be Jessica Benjamin, whose book, The Bonds of Love, came out in 1988. And she then was talking about more about the problems of this kind of heterosexual pairing, particularly focused on a culture in which motherhood was devalued. And so her book is subtitled something about domination and submission. And so she really gets more into, I think, the kind of, although she doesn't use the term narcissism the way I do, what she's describing, to me, very much fits with Cohoutian ways of thinking about the characteristics of narcissism, except that it gets split, as I was saying in my talk today, that the masculine version, narcissism is a dialectical disorder. It's sort of the fluctuation between grandiosity and self-deprecation, longings for merger and intense needs to withdraw from closeness, and idealization of the other and devaluation of the other. So, what I argued in my dissertation, which was actually done at the same time that Bonds of Love was done, was that there was a masculine version of narcissism that was sort of the masculine ideal that was focused around grandiosity, distancing, and devaluation. And then an ideal version of femininity in the culture was the other split of the pairing. Idealization of the male, self-deprecation, and longings for merger. So I would say that then I would think about another landmark year being 1990, when psychoanalytic dialogues first started, or 1991. Third issue of psychoanalytic dialogues was devoted to psychoanalytic feminism. And there was a group of I think 4 people: Muriel Dimon, Adrienne Harris, Jessica Benjamin, and Virginia Goldner, all had essays. They were all colleagues at around the same time at the NYU postdoctoral program, and they had been in a study group together, and they all published articles in that issue that I think were important texts for relational psychoanalytic feminism. And my particular favorite in that issue was Virginia Goldner's piece, which was about all the double binding. It related in a way to what I was talking about today. I think it was sort of a model for me of that, because it talked about all the double binding ways that one's gender identity gets established, that you get one message here and a different message here, and you have to split off this here and you have to split off that there. And she was really talking about relational double binds around gender. I think like an example was the boy whose parents, where the father hits the mother, and the mother says, "You can't grow up to be a man like your father, but you must protect me from men like your father." So, the boy, he gets caught in these kind of gender double binds. Mm-hmm. Then there was lots and lots of articles, psychoanalytic feminist articles that came out in a journal that started. When did it start? I'm not sure when it started, but there was a journal called Gender and
Sexuality.
No, it was first called. Actually, I don't remember what it was called. It was the predecessor of Studies in Gender and Sexuality, and it only existed for a few years. And that was filled with articles that were really from different schools of psychoanalytic feminism. Diane Elise, who was doing somewhat more of a classical analyses, or some of her stuff seemed to, for me, to connect with Irigaray, the work of Irigaray. She had a really great piece called Why a Woman May Not Want to Want, or something like that, which was really terrific. She was also looking at the nursing pair, how the mother and the baby, that there's more mutuality there than the usual story of just mother nursing the baby. Annie Sweetnam did a wonderful article on a Kleinian article about gender as sometimes some versions of gender as rooted in splitting, in a more paranoid schizoid, and other versions of gender as more fluid. And she talked about oscillations between fluidity and rigidity. And so there was lots of stuff that came out in that journal, and then that journal became Studies in Gender and Sexuality. So that would be sort of the New York. The journal was run by the New York Relational School, but it has articles from all different psychoanalytic paradigms. Then I think that the next phase it comes really from the academy and what I was, again, talking about today in terms of a move towards recognizing the intersectionality of identity and that genders are always raced and classed and sexed, and you can't really just separate gender out and study it by itself, which was what was happening, but it was all white women who were doing it was all white psychoanalytic feminists who were talking about gender, and really they were talking about the white middle class. So the work that interests me the most in more recent years is the work that looks at the intersection of identity elements from a psychoanalytic perspective.